Cohen.
Thank you for that kind reception. Wow, it's so good to see so many smiling faces, because that's right. It's never been more right than it is right now. And it's so great to hear Chancellor Roque talk about journalism and not say a word about fake news or that we are the enemy of the people, because of course we're not. We never have been and we never will be, and it's only when we slug hard to make sure that our elected officials tell the truth, that we serve our constituents, which are these days more wide-ranging than ever before. When I was a child back in the Stone Age, before movable type, the main way was newspapers, a little radio. Now many newspapers are faltering and some have gone out of business entirely, but other kinds of media have stepped forward to take their place, fill in the gap, and you know them as well as I do, the 24-hour cable broadcasts, the organizations that didn't even exist as a thought back in the day, the Daily Beast, Politico, all of the organizations that are brand new to this business, but are keeping their finger on the pulse of what's going on and directing a well-aimed kick whenever it's necessary, which these days has been more than ever. My career, 40 plus years as a professional journalist. My background is I graduated from the University of Illinois back in 1959. I worked on the campus newspaper, the Daily Illini, for all 4 years I was there. The best journalism experience I ever got in my life until I graduated and went to work for the newspaper in the town community of the Twin Cities of Champaign and Urbana, Illinois, and the university, total about 125,000 people. There were two competing afternoon newspapers in that community. And boy, I got my ass handed to me so many times by so many reporters who were on the other paper who were much more accustomed to fighting these kinds of battles than I was. And that's the way to learn. If you can get into a competitive situation and watch what other people are doing who are doing the same kind of jobs that you are, you don't steal from them, obviously, but you say, God, she's good. How do I get to do that? How do I get to be that good? That's going to be a lot of what I'm going to talk to you about today, and it's going to be maybe kind of a rambling discussion. I got off a plane from the East Coast about 10:30 last night. But I'd like you guys to participate. Wave your hands in the air if you've got a question, if you've got a point to make, if you find something I've said totally disagreeable and want to scream out the window at me. It's going to be informal. Break in whenever you feel like it. I'll try to answer your questions or counter your arguments. First of all, how many of you are old enough to vote? Anybody? Let's do it the other way. Anybody not old enough to vote? Anybody old enough to vote not registered? One? How come? You got 5 days, go do it. I'm not kidding, do it. People registered who don't intend to vote? Yeah, you're liars. If you sleep late, you won't vote, or if it's rainy, right? Well, the bad guys depend on that. They depend on you sleeping late and being afraid to go out in the rain. Our democracy is unique. It's a crime that less than 60% of our populace votes in the presidential elections. But it's really important. If you say, okay, my vote doesn't count, it's just one vote. Well, I point you out to 2016 when the person who won a popular vote by 3.5 million lost the presidency. I point you back to 2000 when we heard for the first time the words "hanging chads," and the Republican Party, which was much meaner and less constricted by morals, went down and basically took the election from Al Gore and gave it to George Bush, with the help of the very partisan Republican Secretary of State of the state of Florida and your Supreme Court. The only presidency decided by a Supreme Court. So your vote matters. My vote in 1960, my first one went to John Kennedy. The Republican he beat was Richard Nixon. Nixon went to his grave that he was convinced that Kennedy's father, Joe, bought the election and that Mayor Richard Daley of Chicago stole it. And Nixon was probably right. It was a very, very tight election. It was decided only by the Illinois vote and its subcontext, the Chicago and Cook County vote. Joe Kennedy wasn't a tightwad for nothing. He had all this money, but he said, "I'm not buying one more vote than it's necessary." And Richard Daley said, "Vote early, vote often." And a number of people actually came out of the grave in Cook County grave sites to vote in that election. And Kennedy won a narrow victory and became president. So don't say your vote doesn't matter. Your vote matters. A lot of people, you hear a lot of people say, "Oh, this is the most important election of my lifetime." And, you know, come on. If you really live long enough like I have, they're all really important. But here I am to say to you, in less than 2 weeks, the most important election of my lifetime is going to be held. And then in less than 2 years, the next most important election of my lifetime is going to be held. And if I can say that having voted for the first time 58 years ago, you can be sure that you can say it. It's really important. Go out and do it. As I said, there are, now you've got Instagram and Facebook and Snapchat and the Daily Beast and BuzzFeed. Those days we had newspapers. Newspapers with basically one deadline. If the Washington Post got the story already completed, wonderful, ready to go at 10 o'clock in the morning, they had to wait till 12 hours from them from their morning newspaper deadline. And then the reader would not read that story that was prepared a day and a half before until over their coffee the following morning. Well, that doesn't work anymore. Every single person who works on every single news organization in the country is on deadline every minute, because there is no news cycle anymore. There's just one big old news cycle. There's not a morning news cycle. There's not an afternoon news cycle. There are things that, when I got into the business, I would never have dreamed of are happening right now. There was the Today Show. It was kind of quaint because they just chatted about things. Now they're making news. Sometimes the people who are on the show are making the news, and sometimes the people they are interviewing are making news. But they're making news sometimes at 7 o'clock in the morning when no self-respecting person cares about breaking news, but the whole world cares about breaking news. There were no smartphones back when I started. There were no laptops. There were no blogs, no personalized websites, no Apple Watches pouring out information 24 hours a day, even when you don't want to hear it. People actually talk to each other directly or use a landline telephone that if you weren't in the same room. Some of us old farts still do that. Many of you may not have even seen a landline telephone. You don't know what I'm talking about. Many of you wouldn't know what to do if you weren't attached 24 hours a day. I'll bet you that it's taking some people all they can right now not to put their hands in their pocket and pull out those phones and see what they're missing. Well, I don't see anybody doing it, So I'm glad that you're, at least for now, I have you. But what I'm saying, it's a really different world. When I started out working for UPI, there were two deadline every minute news organizations. There was the Associated Press and there was UPI. UPI was smaller, it was the underdog, it had less money, it had fewer staffers, but the competition between the two wire services was it was murder. You just hated the other guys. You hated them. And you hated them even worse when they did something really good that they did better than you. And the way we kept track of who was doing better was we'd log all the newspapers that subscribed to both news services every day. And we checked the top stories, maybe the top 20 or 25 stories, and we'd have a piece of paper and we put a 1 down if they used the UPI story on something, and a 2 down if they put the AP story on something. And every day we had a running log of how we had done the day before. And sometimes we just got, we got creamed. And sometimes we creamed. And boy, that was really exciting. Now everybody is a wire service deadline every minute journalist. I taught a college course around 1990. It was a course on commentary. So we did things like write newspaper play reviews and movie reviews, book reviews, TV reviews, and I promised anybody who got a letter to the editor published in the local newspaper would get an A for the semester. How quaint. Letters to the editor? Come on. I mean, most of these papers where these kids grew up don't exist anymore. Now, you don't need somebody as a gatekeeper to keep you from getting your letter to the editor in the paper. You just get on Facebook and say whatever you please. Or you call up somebody on your cell phone. Or you open the window and scream at the top of your lungs. Your opinions can get out there now. In fact, it's never ending. I bet you somebody will figure a way around these defenses someday, but only if a hurricane causes a blackout, or if your cell phone runs out of battery, or if you're just too tired to pick it up. That's the only way things are ever going to change now. And it's good, because although the flow of information seems endless, and you seem unable to get away from it, even if you want to, it's always better to have more than less. And it's always better to have people who can look at what people are reporting and make up their own minds about whether that's good or bad. I'm gonna read you, if you don't mind, a chapter from the book, if I could find it, that the introducer told you. I wrote a book called Of Course You Can Have Ice Cream for Breakfast, a journalist uncommon memoir. Well, it's fairly recent, and the chapter I'd like to read you is called The President Has Been Shot. And it'll give you, I hope, because you probably have never been in this kind of a situation before, what it's like to be in a newsroom, a competitive newsroom in a competitive news situation at the most exciting and scary time of your life as a communicator. I will read it to you. Break in whenever you feel like it. If there's something you don't understand, let me know. The 40-plus years in journalism, I've heard these terrible words, the president has been shot, twice. The first was on November 22nd, 1963, and nobody alive back then, that's not you guys, or maybe your parents, and probably not even your grandparents, nobody will ever forget exactly where they were and what they were doing when John F. Kennedy was assassinated while riding in a motorcade in Dallas. As a junior staffer in UPI's small Hartford bureau, Hartford, Connecticut, I was scarcely more than a spectator as our national reporters monopolized the wires for 4 days with stories covering every angle of the assassination. The distance between Connecticut and Washington is only about 400 miles, but my bureau may have well been on the moon or Mars that weekend. For hours, I was hunched, mesmerized over our clackety-clacking teletype machines. Google them. They're really cute. That's how the news used to be delivered, a teletype machine that made incredible noise and sent more people deaf in early age than you can imagine, unlike the printers nowadays, which are virtually silent. These machines were carrying riveting story after another riveting story with bylines of UPI colleagues that I knew only by their names on the wire. For his brilliant coverage of the murder of the young president, UPI White House reporter Merriman Smith would win a Pulitzer Prize, which is journalism's highest award. But that weekend in Hartford, as I marveled at the skills of Smitty and his colleagues, I could only dream that someday I might win a transfer to Washington to play with the big boys. A decade later, I joined UPI's most important reporting bureau, but not just as a teammate to a room full of established stars. I would be their boss. On March 30th, 1981, just a couple of months after Ronald Reagan was sworn in as America's 40th president, I walked into the newsroom and heard the horrible words for the second time. The president has been shot. Reagan was targeted by John Warnock Hinckley, a young man haplessly, hopelessly lovesick over an actress he never could possibly have. And I find myself not a few hundred miles away in some small bureau, but right smack in the middle of a story that was as difficult to get a handle on as Jell-O. I'll skip a couple of things that don't matter, but it was on a Monday, and that weekend, Ronald Reagan and his wife Nancy had attended their first Gridiron show. Gridiron is a club of Washington journalists, that about 60 of them, that put on skits every spring mocking the politicians and the media with original songs set to old tunes, original lyrics, old tunes. Anyhow, Reagan was attending his first Gridiron, and he was delighted to discover that his wife, Nancy, who was the target of merciless criticism for imperial tastes as she put her fashion stamp on White House drapes and china patterns, had slipped from the head table seat to reappear on the stage in tattered rags, singing amusing new lyrics to the old Roaring Twenties hit, Secondhand Rose, which one of you or two may have even heard of that song. If not, I'll be glad to sing it for you. Her parody was secondhand clothes. It delighted her husband, it charmed her detractors, it captured front page headlines, and brilliantly melted her Ice Queen image. Less than 48 hours later, her husband, the president, would be fighting for his life at George Washington Memorial Hospital. Things were quiet in the newsroom early Monday afternoon, so I told the night editor that I was going to return my Gridiron tuxedo and go home because I had a headache from probably a little too much wine that weekend. But with a few minutes to kill before I actually got on a bus, I went back upstairs to the newsroom, and Dave Weisler looked at me and said, "The president has been shot." And that was the last thought of my headache or going home. It was bedlam. Teletype bells were clanging out bulletins. Staffers were barking into phones. Relief creased Dave Weisler's face when he saw me, that I was not actually on the bus going home. I rushed to a computer to lead a legion of rewrite deskers who would serve as UPI's nerve center for the next 12 hours. I began assembling a preliminary story based on bits and pieces of information from our White House reporters, especially Dean Reynolds, who had been on the scene as UPI's man at the Washington Hilton Hotel when Reagan got shot. In the dozen hours following the fateful shots, the frenzy never abated. Lead writers churned out dozens of updated versions of the main story, every word under Dean Reynolds' byline. Dean had been inches away from the presidential limousine, which was idling outside the hotel, when Hinckley fired 6 shots that wounded Reagan, wounded his press secretary, Jim Brady, a DC police officer, and a Secret Service agent. Dean Reynolds raced the wrong way up a hotel escalator and dashed across the lobby to the check-in desk, where he grabbed a phone from the startled clerk and dictated UPI's bulletin. 35 years later, and now widely admired network television correspondent. This is what Dean Reynolds recalls about that day. I remember that day like it was yesterday. My first call was answered on the desk by Elliot Brenner. And my first words, I believe, were shots were fired at President Reagan as he left the Washington hotel. Dean Reynolds couldn't wait around long enough to see if the shots hit Reagan. And there was no way he could follow the presidential limousine, which made a beeline at speeds you wouldn't believe down Connecticut Avenue to the GW Hotel. And this is more of Dean Reynolds. Elliot was calm and collected as I went on describing the scene. I remember momentarily losing my composure at the enormity of what I was dictating. Get back, yelled the Secret Service agents. Elliot could hear the emotion in my voice and said, steady, partner. I always remember these words and the underlying meaning that we were all partners every day at UPI. His recollection brilliantly summed up the ethos that carried UPI through 80 years of competition at the pinnacle of the journalism world. We were all partners every day at UPI. My computer screen is just a few steps from where Dave Weisler sits in the slot. All of our stories will flow to him for final approval before he pushes a computer button and sends them flying on the wire to UPI subscribers all over the world. I positioned a reporter, Pat Koza, at my side. She was going to be my eyes and ears. She clutches the TV. We only had one TV. We were poor. She clutches the TV remote for dear life. Like Siamese twins, we are inseparable for what seemed like forever. No need for instructions. Pat knows exactly what I will be needing. Keep clicking the remote and changing the channels. I must know exactly what the three major networks are reporting at every second. Across the city, our reporters are scrambling for tidbits. Secretary of State Alexander Haig takes the podium in the White House briefing room and proclaims grandiloquently, as of now, I am in control here in the White House. Haig, a retired Army general accustomed to delivering orders that were obeyed swiftly and absolutely, has blithely ignored the Constitution's order of presidential succession. When the president is incapacitated, the vice president, in this case George H.W. Bush, takes over. And after that comes the Speaker of the House and the Senate President, respectively. Secretary of State is fifth. So Alexander isn't even close to being in control here. That careless burst of bravado will make a man who had devoted his entire adult life to his country become the butt of cruel jokes forever. When Alexander Haig died, that was in the first paragraph of the obit. On Capitol Hill, UPI staffers buttonhole everyone, furiously hunting any nugget. We transmit everything we can confirm. Reaction, analysis, history of attacks on presidents, how the country will be governed until Reagan recovers, if he recovers. Several reporters are working from a makeshift briefing room at GW Hospital, where the president is in emergency surgery. In a nearby operating room, Press Secretary Jim Brady lies unconscious as a neurosurgical team races to control his brain hemorrhaging. Brady's prognosis is beyond grim. Any moment, we are certain we will be reporting that Jim Brady is dead. This stuff is the meat and potatoes of the wire service, the very reason we lived. Using our international message wires, we implore bureaus around the country to unearth anything, however insignificant it may seem, on John Hinckley and Jodie Foster, the young actress who was the unwitting muse behind John Hinckley's rampage. Our reporters react with alacrity. The Denver Bureau tracks down the gunman's family in suburban Evergreen, Colorado. John Hinckley Sr. is the chairman of Vanderbilt Energy Corporation, and he's contributed big bucks to George Bush's unsuccessful presidential challenge to Reagan in 1980. In fact, Hinckley's older brother, Scott, has a dinner date the following night with Bush's son, Neil. This is interesting, if not crucial, but at that point it goes right into our story, because we don't have a lot to work on. 16 minutes after the shooting, our Dallas Bureau reports that the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms has learned that Hinckley purchased a $47 handgun at Rocky's Pawn Shop in Dallas, Texas. Plus, Hinckley had been an inconsistent and vaguely intermittent student at Texas Tech University in Lubbock. Into the story that goes. The 6 illegal and almost always fatal Devastator bullets Hinckley fired are specifically configured to explode on impact. The first 2 hit Brady and the DC cop. The third, a building across the street. The fourth, a Secret Service agent. And the fifth bounces off the bullet-resistant window of the presidential limo. The final one ricochets off the limo and through Reagan's left rib cage, settling in his lung. Luckily, none of these Devastator bullets exploded, or the 4 men would be dead right then. Into that story that goes. UPI staffers in Nashville report that Hinckley had been arrested on gun charges in 1980, the year before, for stalking Reagan's predecessor, Jimmy Carter. My old bureau chips in Hartford, Connecticut. Excuse me. They get in touch with Jodie Foster, who's a student at Yale, believe it or not. This actress decided she wanted to go back to school and study theatrics at Yale. She has no idea that this deranged young man has shot the president in an inconceivably aberrant effort to impress her. Jodie Foster, famous actress and now Ivy League co-ed, into our story. From UPI's Vernon Scott in Los Angeles comes word that Hinckley's infatuation with Foster began a few years earlier when he saw the film Taxi Driver. If you haven't seen Taxi Driver, hit it. Go to YouTube and get it. It is scary as hell. It's Robert De Niro at his absolute most frightening. Hinckley apparently identified with Robert De Niro's character, Travis Bickle, a cabbie who befriended a 12-year-old prostitute played by Jodie Foster. The plot thickens. Hinckley has seen this movie 15 times. Towards the end of the film, to impress her, Bickle attempted to assassinate a senator running for president. Binkle, Hinckley, could this stuff get any more bizarre? As Hinckley's obsession with Foster grew, he followed her around the country, even enrolling in a creative writing course at Yale in 1980. He began writing and phoning her, refusing to take no for an answer. At her wit's end, reports our Hartford crew, she turned the matter over to the New Haven police. But Hinckley was one step ahead of the law. He fled before they could investigate. Appropriating the film's narrative, he decides to kill a politician to impress Jodie Foster, who, many years later, would ironically reveal, anybody? That she was a lesbian. So here's this Hinckley, who can't get this woman out of his mind and shot a president in order to get her attention, doesn't know that she's a lesbian, which is, that goes into the story with me muttering, you can't make this crap up. In mid-afternoon, our wire service competitors, the Associated Press and Reuters, report that the shambling Brady, whom reporters adore and endearingly call the Bear, has died on the operating room table at GW Hospital. UPI-only subscribers on deadline jam our switchboard with frantic calls and are told that UPI hasn't been able to confirm Brady's death. My mood darkens. We are getting creamed on an important piece of the biggest news story, maybe of my life. When reporter Peter Brown phones in from GW, I tell him, find out if Brady is dead. I don't care how. Steal scrubs and get into the operating room if you have to. We can't get back into this crucial competition without confirmation on Brady. I don't try to sugarcoat our dismal predicament. Peter, goddammit, find out if Brady's dead. Clicking her clicker, Pat Koza lands on ABC as veteran anchorman Frank Reynolds is informing viewers that Brady is dead, quoting both AP and Reuters. The pressure mounts on us. From Capitol Hill, veteran reporter Steve Gerstel calls in to say he has just been told by Tennessee Senator Howard Baker that Brady is dead. I've never trusted any reporter more than the peerless Steve Gerstel, and I know how close he and Senator Baker were. But I tell Steve, no, it must come from a responsible source at the hospital. Suddenly, Peter Brown is on the line. Brady's alive, he shouts. Who says? Nofziger. Lynn Nofziger. Lynn Nofziger was at Reagan's side from the back lots at Warner Brothers Studios in Hollywood before Reagan ever thought about being a politician. And he followed them to the governor's mansion in Sacramento and is now at the pinnacle in the White House. Nofziger's word is plenty good enough for me. We rush out a bulletin. Everyone else is wrong. UPI is right. Brady is alive. Stay tuned. Meanwhile, Frank Reynolds, eyes flashing, angrily as he reads our bulletin, dramatically pounds his desk and thunders, "This is a man's life we're talking about." I raise my eyes briefly from my computer keyboard to shout at the TV. "Believe the UPI story, you idiot. The one that got your son's name on it." Of course he can't hear me, but it's true. Our Dean Reynolds' father is ABC's Frank Reynolds. Brady's continued presence on the planet goes immediately into our story. Thank you, Lynn Nofziger. Great job, Peter Brown. That's what works at UPI. The reporter at the scene rarely got the byline and the glory. The vital supporting cast labored in anonymity. Some of the best rewrite men and women spent entire careers crafting brilliant stories under other people's bylines. Teammates endlessly subjugating and selflessly subjugating ego for the greater good is just one reason why UPI was the best goddamn job I ever had by miles. When the loose ends finally are tied up about 2 a.m., I glance at the stack of stories that are spilling crazy quilt off oversized clipboards. Tens of thousands of words from dozens of reporters, crafted by brilliant writers under excruciatingly competitive deadlines. Never a false step, never a mistake. Flawless. Flawless contributions from bureaus from the Atlantic to the Pacific and points in between. I had been a unipresser for 20 years, and I still only know some of that day's biggest heroes by their bylines on the wire. Thinking of that day still gives me goosebumps. Goosebumps writing this chapter, too. Merriman Smith, who committed suicide in 1969, would have been proud. Pat Koza had missed her last bus hours ago, so I drive miles on my way to take her home. We quietly replay the dozen hours we had just spent together as this makeshift tag team. Pat opens the car door and steps into the darkness in front of her house, then leans back through the window. "That was the most amazing day I've ever spent," she says. Thanks for letting me be part of it." I love you, Pat Koza. I will always love you for that day, and now you and everybody else knows it. A year later, on April 5th, 1982, UPI managing editor H.L. Stevenson phones me from New York. In a few minutes, the Pulitzer Prizes will be announced by my journalism alma mater, Columbia University. "I just got a call from the Pulitzer Board," he tells me. "You guys are runner-up in the national reporting category." I am stunned. What could possibly have beaten out our flawless coverage of the attempted murder of the President of the United States? I soon found out. It was Rick Atkinson of the Kansas City Star for, quote, "a series of national articles about the water supply of greater Kansas City." Now, I have never met Atkinson, and I'm sure he's a very fine fellow. But come on, Pulitzer jurors, you are the cream of our profession. Drinking water in Kansas City versus the president has been shot. Atkinson would go on to share a Pulitzer in 1999 as a reporter for the Washington Post, and won another 4 years later for the first of a trilogy of bestsellers about World War II. Pulitzer scoreboard, Rick Atkinson 3, Ron Cohen 0. Jim Brady spent 10 harrowing hours on the operating table and was still unconscious when they wheeled him after midnight into his room in GW Hospital's intensive care unit. A nurse sits with him through the night, periodically moistening his lips and watching the tiny lights on his respirator, blinking eerily green in the ICU darkness. Her weary eyes suddenly snap open. "Have I nodded off?" she said to herself. "Am I hallucinating? Or had Jim Brady's right hand really moved?" She stares hard at that hand, and sure enough, a half minute later, he's doing it again. Painfully, slowly, the bear's right claw reaches towards his nightstand, pulls a single sheet of Kleenex from its dispenser, crumbles it in one hand, and tosses it in super slow motion towards a trash can. Dr. Arthur Cobreen, still asleep after performing 12 hours of surgery, groggily picks up the phone that is ringing on his bedside night table at 5:30 in the morning. Not only is Jim Brady alive, Cobreen hears the ICU nurse say, he is conscious and shooting hoops. Cobreen, a renowned neurosurgeon, is a brusque, no-nonsense, seemingly unsentimental man Whoever coined the phrase, good bedside manner, had never met Arthur Cobreen. Yet his heart leaps. Against overwhelming odds, he has saved Jim Brady's life. Maybe he's the only person on the planet who could have. When he looks into Brady's room a short time later, Cobreen sees the proof for himself, wadded up balls of Kleenex littering the perimeter of his patient's wastebasket. Now, it just so happens that Dr. Cobreen, in later years, would perform 3 back surgeries on my wife, Jill. I've never seen a better doctor in my life. Brady's speech and brain functions were badly compromised, but he would survive for 33 years after that shooting, largely confined to a wheelchair. He and his wife, Sarah, became tireless advocates for handgun control, and in 1993, Congress passed the Brady Law, requiring federal background checks for handgun purchases. Sarah Brady died early in 2015, 8 months after her husband died. And of course, since then, Congress has basically gutted the Brady Rule. 9 months after the shooting, in my capacity as chairman of the Washington Press Club's annual Salute to Congress dinner, we secretly invite Jim Brady and Sarah. 800 formally dressed diners barely are settled into their seats in the dark ballroom of the Shoreham Hotel when a huge spotlight leaps to life and zeroes in on the 2 large double doors being pushed open. There is Sarah Brady wheeling her husband into the room. And up the head table ramp, his first public appearance since that fateful afternoon last March. Crusty journalists shrug off their carefully nurtured cynicism and leap to their feet, whistling and shouting, stomping, and shedding tears of happiness. At the head table, UPI's chief political reporter, Clay Richards, greets his fraternity brother with a Sigma Chi handshake and a "Hi, Brother Bear." Brady, eyes moist, haltingly rasps his reply. Thank you. I'm going to break up over this, so bear with me a second. Thank you, UPI, for not killing me. Rick Atkinson, congratulations on your Pulitzers, because Jim Brady's thank you is prize enough for me. I hope that gives you a little idea of what it's like to be in the center of a monstrously breaking news story coming at you from all angles, not knowing what's true and what's false, and not immediately be able to find out what's true and what's false, which is why you see so much of the 24-hour cable news programs, well, cable talk and entertainment programs, flailing away in the midst of breaking news and finding 3 loops of television tape that they keep running over and over and over again for the next 15 hours because they don't have anything more recent that close to the actual incident. So when a gunman shoots a bunch of people in San Bernardino and they have a picture of somebody grabbing the guy, they're showing that 15 hours from now because it's such a visual medium. It's not just enough just to read brilliant prose like I just read. The words don't mean as much to the TV viewers and the people today as the visuals. Yeah, somebody had a question.
I was at what you just commented. I wanted to ask, besides this fake news that's going about, wanted you to comment on the fact that this 24-hour news cycle, there's constant incorrect facts coming out, and then they have to correct themselves. And it seems like it's getting worse. So I was just wondering, do you see a way where it's going to come back to where they're not going to release information until they actually have the truth?
No, the competitive urges are just too, they're too powerful. You know, the New York Times subscriptions are up enormously since Trump got sworn in. The Washington Post I've been in Washington for 47 years, and I've gotten the Post delivered to my front door now in the driveway, so the old guy has to actually bend over and get it. Every day, Monday through Sunday, for 47 years, since the day I first moved into our house. They are now owned by Bezos. You know Bezos? Amazon. And Bezos can afford it, and he said, hire whoever you want and as many as you want. And the Washington Post has increased its staff by about 400 since Trump got elected. And the paper is the best it's ever been in the 47 years I'm reading it. Not only because of the number of people, but because of the insatiable interest in what's going on. This, something wild is happening every minute of every day. We're alive these days now. Most of it emanating from the White House. And people want to know what's going on. And that crush of competitive spirit, we're not going to get back to those other days. And it's too bad. And if you're suggesting that that possibly fuels people believing the fake news and the enemies of the people's shit, I'm sorry, this is going to be on the radio. Blip that out, if you will. Actually, this is a newsroom, so people talk like this, and sometimes even worse. It's going to be hard for the other side saying, we're not fake news. You know, this is not fake news. This is what we know, so we make mistakes. Journalism's always, the best definition of journalism I ever heard is this: the first rough draft of history. You go with what you got, and then you go with more as you learn it. You do your best not to put out anything that's not, that you haven't substantiated, at least from one or two reliable places. But it's competitive, it's tough. It's really tough. I don't see that going back. And it's too bad, because some of the journalism that's being done today is way better than the stuff that I was doing when I was working. Anybody else got something to break in on? Yeah.
At the beginning you were saying about how, you know, the people who win popular vote can still lose the election type thing. Do you feel that
No.
maybe?
No. Do you know what it takes to change that? It takes a 2/3 votes of each House of Congress, presidential approval, and then the approval of 38 of the 50 state legislatures to amend the Constitution. Not going to happen. You guys are too young to remember. I don't even know when it was, but it probably was the 70s and 80s. The women's movement got a constitutional amendment actually passed in both the House and Senate, an Equal Rights Amendment, ERA. And if you don't know anything about it, you should Google it, because it was amazing stuff. And it's still going on. You know, the Me Too movement is an outgrowth of this stuff getting better and better and better the older and older I get. The ERA, we don't have an ERA. We could not pass a constitutional amendment that guaranteed women equal rights. We couldn't do that. It took 8 years, about probably a dozen or 15 legislatures approved it. A couple turned it down. Some of them never even bothered to vote on it. So no, an amendment to do away with the Electoral College is not likely to happen. Now, there's other ways to do it. You can call for a constitutional convention and have a constitutional convention ratify an amendment, a new amendment. That's also a long and difficult process. And in the current atmosphere, where we can't even get one party to cast one vote for something, for the opposition party to cast one vote for anything the president is putting up, what are you going to do? I mean, it's not going to happen. The atmosphere is too fervent and too wild and too partisan for there to be a constitutional convention anytime in the near future. There's other ways of doing things, and one of them is to change our stupidity about the first Tuesday in November being Election Day, a day that's not a holiday, that people have to somehow cram a vote into their day where they're working, or whether they're picking up their kids at soccer, or whether they're heading off for the third job of the day to make ends meet. It should be a holiday, right? And it can be Tuesday, but Election Day should be Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. All non-work days. If they can make Martin Luther King's birthday be a national holiday, they can make Monday before Election Day and Election Day a national holiday. If you do that, you eliminate a lot of the inequities of the current voting system. And that can be done on a national basis. How the states react to that is their own province, because the secretaries of state of each state are the ones who are responsible for enforcing the laws that the state legislatures adopt as far as their local voting, state voting is concerned. There's a really incredible situation going on now. A guy named Brian Land is running for governor of Georgia. He's running against a woman who would be the first female black governor in America's history. And so what are we going to do? We're going to try to suppress the minority vote, right? Because we can't do that. We can't let something like that happen. So this guy who is running for governor, who is also, anybody know? You should know, this is a big story. What other job does he have? Oh no, come on people, you guys are journalists or would-be journalists. This guy's a Secretary of State in Georgia, and he's running for governor. He's running for office and he's running the election. And he's invalidated 50,000 voter registration rolls, almost all of them poor blacks, because the Georgia legislature passed a law that basically has been shortened to exact replica. If you make the slightest mistake on your voter registration application versus your driver's license or your Social Security card, your vote will not be counted. So if your name is Jennifer T. Jones, and you register as Jennifer T. Jones in Georgia, and you don't put the period after the T, too bad, Jenny, you're a goner. Outrageous. Any normal human being in any normal political climate would have stepped aside and turned over the Secretary of State duties to somebody else while he's running for governor. It's now 2 weeks and 5 days before voting, 6 days before voting, and he's still the Secretary of State. He's still enforcing the state voting regulations, and he's still running for governor. And the Democrats have filed suit, and I don't know whether it's going to do any good or not, but he's clearly, and if you haven't seen, you haven't seen his ads because you haven't even heard of this guy, unfortunately. You haven't seen his ads, go Google them, his political ads. He campaigns off the side of a pickup truck holding a gun. And there's a gun rack in the pickup truck, and he's got something in his hand, and you can't tell what it is, but it's a hand grenade, and he throws it over his shoulder, and there's a big explosion about 30 yards behind him. And this is what he's doing. He's appealing to the very people that he needs to get out to vote to counter the minority vote that is going to go for the black Democratic gubernatorial candidate. It's a fascinating thing. It's the kind of thing that if you get to be journalists, I want you to be out there reporting this stuff, breaking these kinds of stories. This is stuff that is so crucial to our way of living and the democracy, which we're attempting in the last few years to make a mockery of. We can't let this happen. We can't let this happen. Okay, get off my high horse for a minute. Show of hand. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was just wondering if you were familiar with the 2016 presidential election construct, which was a voter regulation that, and there was only 8 states that arbiter of this, oversaw this cross-check regulation, Chris Kobach, who also worked on the Trump campaign.
And then what did he do?
And then he was.
Then he was appointed to a commission by President Trump to study vote fraud. Give me a break. Talking about letting the fox into the hen house. You don't know that one, but that phrase was useful back when I was a kid. Yeah, and and they had to disband that commission. It was a presidential commission, and they had to disband it after a couple of months because it was such a joke. Every single study that's been made on voting fraud has come up with the answer, the conclusion, that there isn't any voting fraud in this country. You know, there's a lot of people who don't vote, and a lot of people who vote stupidly, but there's no voting fraud. But you can be sure that as long as there is a minority party that wants to continue to be viable, and a majority party where minorities and poor people are being discouraged from voting, that stuff's going to happen. It's going to happen because if most of the country is Democrats and independents, and 30% of the country is Republicans, how are Republicans going to ever stay in office? They're going to have to somehow convince the independents that what they're doing is right, and they should vote for them, or they're going to have to figure out ways to suppress voting, and that's kind of what's happening. It's happening all over the country. In North Dakota, the senator, U.S. senator from North Dakota, his name is Heidi Heitkamp. She's fighting for her political life because they don't get much redder than North Dakota. And she's running against a Republican who's putting up a good challenge and who is probably favored to win her seat. Well, he might get some help from the Secretary of State in North Dakota, who has just ruled that Native Americans, when they present their credentials at the polling place, have to have their house number and street name on their application. Well, Indian reservations, most of them don't have streets named, and none of them have houses named, numbered. And so a huge segment of the North Dakota population that might be in Heidi Heitkamp's camp, that could be it. The Republican Secretary of State is trying to invalidate their votes and make sure that the Republican wins. This is happening everywhere. It's happening in New Hampshire. The governor of New Hampshire has signed a bill passed by the legislature, the Republican legislature in New Hampshire, saying that even if you have a driver's license from New Hampshire, if you are an out-of-state student and have come to New Hampshire from Connecticut, you can't vote in New Hampshire. You can register, you can be registered and everything, and you can have a driver's license, but we won't count your vote because you should be voting back in Connecticut where you belong. Voter suppression. It's all over the country. You live in a state where it doesn't matter. You can't suppress enough votes in California to have the Republicans win. You just can't. But you could in some of the congressional districts. But for statewide office, you guys have proved that, you got the 5th largest economy in the world, and you're happy with the way it's been run for the last 25 years. So the more people talk about voter fraud, the more you guys ought to look at what the studies show. There isn't any. Okay, moving on. I want another raise of hands. How many people are seriously considering going into the profession of journalism? Okay, that's good. That's about half of you. I welcome you all. Those of you who are in here and want to do something else with your life, good, more power to you. You'll probably be a lot richer than your classmates. But I don't want you to take that to mean that it's not important for you to be politically active and civically active. Even if if you're not covering it, do it. Do what's right. Go out there and do what's right. Also, it's one of the, this has now turned into one of the most dangerous professions in the world outside of the military and outside of the police and fire. Last year, 263 journalists were killed in the line of duty. That's that's a record, 4 more than the previous record, which was set the year before. So what we're talking about is 630 journalists have been killed doing their jobs around the world in the last 2 years, right? And countless thousands incarcerated. A newspaper right close to where I live in Maryland, the Annapolis paper, Annapolis Capital Gazette, just this past June, a gunman burst into the office of this fairly small community newspaper and shot 7 people, 5 of them fatally, because he was unhappy about coverage that they had done over the last few years about his mostly criminal life. And he got pissed and he came in with a gun and he killed 5 innocent people doing their jobs. I didn't know any of the victims, but I have lost several friends, colleagues over the years who have been killed covering the Vietnam War and other conflicts. One close friend when we worked together at UPI was a woman named Marie Colvin, who was a correspondent for the Sunday Times of London when she was deliberately shot and killed 6 years ago while covering the civil war in Syria. There is a new movie coming out about Marie's life. It's called A Private War. She is portrayed by an actress, award-winning actress named Rosamund Pike, whom you may know of, and also famous actor in the movie is famous actor named Stanley Tucci. In 2001, Marie Colvin was honored as the top foreign correspondent in the world. She cut a handsome figure, often wearing a double string of pearls given to her by Yasser Arafat, the longtime leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Her renown was burnished by the patch that she wore over her left eye, a black patch. She lost the eye to shrapnel while she was covering fighting in Sri Lanka in 2004. The owner of the Times of London, a man whose name you might be acquainted with, Rupert Murdoch, called Marie Colvin the greatest war correspondent in history. And because she was so high profile, and because the government forces in Syria despised her coverage, they targeted her and murdered her. And while she was covering the Syrian civil war. 1 week before she was killed in Syria, the world lost another famed journalist, Anthony Shadid, a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter for the New York Times and the Washington Post, who also died while he was covering the war in Syria. His death hit very hard. In my family, my daughter Rachel, some of you may know, who's a professor in the ESL department, worked with Tony Shadid at the Daily Cardinal at the University of Wisconsin in the late 1980s, and she still tears up when she hears his name. Of course, you know, unless you've been on a rock for the last 10 days, you know about the Washington Post reporter Jamal Khashoggi, who was horribly murdered for all intents and purposes, in the Saudi embassy in Turkey. He wrote some bad things that Saudi monarchy didn't particularly like, even though Khashoggi is a Saudi national. And apparently he was going into the Saudi embassy in Istanbul to get finish up the papers for the marriage he was about to undertake in a week. And he never made it out of that building It appears that from tapes and from video that he was tortured, chopped into little pieces, and the body disposed of. And it's fairly obvious that a group of 15 thugs hired by the monarchy in Saudi Arabia flew into Istanbul, murdered Khashoggi, and flew out basically the same day. And the President of the United States didn't jump up and down and scream. First of all, he's a Saudi citizen. Second of all, Saudi Arabia is on the hook to us for $100 billion in weapons, and the president doesn't want to do anything that would endanger those contracts to buy those weapons. And he said, you know, this could be a horde of people that nobody knows who they are. And the fact is that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and Kushner, Jared Kushner, President Trump's son-in-law, are bosom buddies. So the reaction of the United States to this horrendous crime has been so muted as to basically cause the world to look on in total consternation. Is defense money that important to us, that even a single life should be thrown away like that? So he says, who knows? Maybe these people could have been rogue killers. Well, pretty clear they weren't. So what do you think? Do the dangers that journalists face these days make anyone think twice about going into this business, and why? Who of you had their hands up before? Anybody having second thoughts when you hear about this? Yeah.
I love what I do, and nothing that someone else is going to do to intimidate me is going to stop me from doing what I do.
I thank you. That's exactly the answer I was hoping for. I probably am too chicken and too old to go back to my old profession now myself, but I like that young kids are braver and less frightened than I am. Yeah, somebody.
I feel like it empowers me the more I see the attack on me. It makes me want to do it more and get out there more.
Okay. Well, I think that's basically what the people who are actually working as journalists and covering politics in Washington are feeling these days. They feel very embattled. They see a president who talks about fake news, and they see a president physically make fun of a New York Times journalist who has got disabilities. And they say, you know, what are we going to do? We're going to let them get away with this stuff. Well, I don't know. It's pretty interesting. It's a pretty interesting subject, and I don't know what the answer is. I think that yes, you got to hang in there and tell the truth, because that's what journalists have always tried to do. There's some bad apples in the barrel, and I can point you to names right now, but I won't. But if we don't, we're part of the First Amendment. Journalists are part of the First Amendment to the Constitution. And if we aren't there holding the feet to the fire of the people who are responsible for what's going on, who's going to do it? Certainly not the accountants of the world. Maybe a stray lawyer or two who's got a good heart. But journalists, this is what we do. And I want you to do it, God damn it. God darn it. I want you to do it when you get to be journalists. Don't take any guff from anybody. You don't have to be brutal. You don't have to shove people around. You just do your job. You do it quietly. You do it well. And my ghost will come back and thank you personally for that. Okay. I don't know. What else can we talk about? You want me to give you a couple of tips? I'll give you a couple of tips. Okay. This is kind of a funny. This is half serious, half fun. Download the dictionary.com. Because every day you can fix it so they'll give you a new word, right? And it'll teach you what that word means. It'll use it in a sentence, and it will do for you the things that your high school and junior high school English teachers failed you on. They didn't give a darn about, or the school systems or the powers that be at the state level didn't care about grammar. They didn't care about punctuation. They didn't care that it's important to make the subject and the verb agree. They didn't care whether you could write a coherent sentence and write an essay. And that's just been getting worse and worse and worse. So you got to do it yourself. You know, you just got to be self-help, because you're not going to get it in very many places in your schools. So today's word was patzer, P-A-T-Z-E-R. I never heard of the word patzer, and I got a pretty good-sized vocabulary. A patzer is a casual amateurish chess player. Okay, you're probably never going to use that, but you might. Take it home today and tell somebody you love, you know what a patzer is? I know what a patzer is. Or use the word patzer in a sentence and have them look at you. Wow, this city college really gives you a great education, right? Okay. You might find it fun, and you probably will learn something that you're probably not going to learn anyplace else. Okay, that's part fun. This is not. Read, 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 read. And make some of it not be through an electronic device. Read fiction, read nonfiction, read biography, read history, read newspapers, remember what those are, read magazines. There is, in every community, a public library. Go get it. You don't have to even go to the library. I get my stuff out of the public library and read it on a tablet. I can take the books out, and I send them back, and I only have to get in the car to drive there. And they'll let me know when it's going to be overdue. Read. And when you read, stop and ask yourself why. If you see something that really gets to you, a sentence that really gets to you, ask yourself, why? Why? What made that conglomeration of words something that touched me? Now, I'm not saying go steal the work of good writers, for crying out loud. By all means, do not steal anything. The first rule of journalism is don't steal anybody else's work and pass it off as your own. But reading good writing will not only help you become a better writer, but you'll learn stuff. And learning and knowing stuff is not only a key to success in any field, it is a whole hell of a lot of fun. If you are literate, you can work in any profession, and you can make the other illiterates that are in the profession with you look stupid, because most of them don't know anything. They couldn't write a cogent, cohesive paragraph if their life depended on it. You can. Illiteracy is so rampant these days that if you can put together something that even resembles something that's interesting that people want to read, you'll stand out, no matter what field you specialize in. Okay, I will soon be 82. I know it, I only look 26. But I am reading and learning still. And I'm being bowled over when I stumble upon something sensational. I still, after 82 years, I'm just knocked over when I read something that's so wonderful. In here, I'm reading a library book called The Straight Man. And it's by a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, contemporary author named Richard Russo. He's won a Pulitzer Prize. Several of his books have been made into terrific movies. Empire Falls, for one. The movies are great. The books are great. He's written a lot of stuff, so you can, even if you're old like me and you've read it once, you've forgotten it, you can read it again. I'm reading this Straight Man right now at my gym on my exercycle, pedaling away for 45 minutes at a time, and every time I get to the end of the page, I hit the button and it goes to the next page. Brilliant! It's brilliant. And a couple of days ago, I hit chapter 15. Now, this book has probably got 75 chapters, and many of them are quite good. Chapter 15, oh my God. He should win a Pulitzer Prize just for chapter 15. And I'm sitting on a bike, and I'm riding away, and I'm reading this stuff, and I'm laughing. And I'm going, ah, like that, like, God, why can't I write that sentence? From the first sentence of that chapter to the last sentence of that chapter, it was brilliant. It was just brilliant. And I'm almost at the end of the book now, and I'm very unhappy. But I'm gonna put the book, send the book back to the library, and a year from now I'm gonna forget I've read it, and I'm gonna go back and read it again. Okay, here is from Sunday's New York Times. One of the many people who subscribe to the New York Times now that their subscription rate has gone up so high. Okay, this is 8 pages, a special section, 8 pages. Special section, color photos, thousands and thousands of words, and they made this a special part of the paper, not just stuck somewhere among the truss ads. If you don't know what a truss is, look it up. It'll probably come up on dictionary.com someday. I'm gonna read you, if I can find my glasses. Oh my God, where are my glasses? They're in my pocket. I'm gonna read you just the first 3 paragraphs. I haven't finished it yet, by the way. That's how long it is. But I read the first 3 paragraphs, and I read them aloud to my wife, and I said, I would kill to be able to write 3 paragraphs like this. Okay. Just as a little background, this is the case of a woman whose name is Jane Doe Ponytail, because they don't know her last name. Jane Doe, she's unknown, and her ponytail. Subtitled, An Epic Tragedy on a Small Block in Queens. And the headline is, A Woman Begins to Fall. With her long dark hair in a ponytail and her black and red scarf loose around her neck, she is plummeting from a 4th floor balcony through the neon-charged November night. Below awaits 40th Road, a gritty street of commerce in the Flushing section of Queens. Chinese restaurants and narrow storefronts, and dim stairwells leading to private transactions. Strivers and dawdlers, and passers-by, all oblivious to what is transpiring above them. Remember, this lady is falling. But before the pavement ends the woman's descent, a few feet from a restaurant's glittering Christmas tree, imagine her face suddenly suspended, her body freeze-framed in midair, if only for a moment. Now, you don't know anything about this lady. You really don't, because it's only 3 paragraphs. But by God, if you are not moved to read the rest of this thing, then you don't have any life left in you. And this guy who wrote this will then tell you who Jane Doe Ponytail is and why she, and the factors that led up to this moment when she is plummeting from the 4th floor balcony, and what happens after she hits, after her descent. I mean, what a beautiful word to describe what was happening. Her descent, as if she was calmly walking down a flight of stairs. He's trying to suspend time. Brilliant. It's brilliant. I hope you think it's brilliant, because I really think it's brilliant. Anyhow, the rest of it is going to tell you who she was, how she got there, what happened to her. And the fact that her name is Jane Doe Ponytail tells you you're never going to find the whole story. The man who wrote this is named Dan Barry. Dan Barry is my favorite newsman of all time. He's not Dave Barry. Dave Barry is a comedian who happens to be a newsman. Dan Barry is a poet who happens to be a newsman. I'm not saying that one is better than the other in what they do, Although Dan Barry could never tell a joke like Dave Barry does, and Dave Barry in a million years could never write 3 paragraphs like that. Okay, your assignment from me. Google Dan Barry, D-A-N-B-A-R-R-Y, and read some of his stuff. See if get to this, because this, you can still get this in the New York Times archives. It's just 3 days ago. Read some of his stuff. He, for years, was the national features reporter for the New York Times, which meant he could go anywhere in the country and find great stories and write about them however he wanted to. And if you don't think that's the best job that I ever heard of, I think it's the best job I ever heard of. I wish I was good enough to do that. And he's written a book. These stories have been collected in a book called This Land, which was the name of his column. Okay, you can get the book, or you can read them individually. And he first came to my attention when they sent him down to New Orleans after Katrina. He got there immediately after Katrina, when the crap was still hitting the fan and the water was still killing people. The stuff he wrote, they put it on the front page every day. It was so evocative and so brilliant and so doing what journalists have always wanted to do, and not many of them can. Take the reader and stick them right directly in the middle of the story, as if they are there with him at their side. He did this, and he did it for about 6 straight days, and the whole country was walking around with their eyebrows raised. How can somebody be this good? Okay, Dan Barry, This Land. One last thing about Dan Barry. Not Dave Barry, Dan Barry. He has written a book called The Bottom of the 33rd. This is about the longest baseball game ever played. Longest professional baseball game ever played. He covered it while he worked for the Providence Journal. The game took place in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and it was between the Boston farm team, who are called the Pawtucket Paw Sox, and the Rochester Red Wings, which was the Baltimore Orioles farm team. Playing on the Paw Sox was one of the greatest third basemen that ever walked the face of the earth before he ever got to the major leagues, still a minor leaguer. His name is Wade Boggs. He's in the Hall of Fame. The shortstop for the Rochester Red Wings also is in the Hall of Fame. He also has a baseball record that will never be broken in anybody's lifetime. Consecutive games played. His name was Cal Ripken. These two guys are two of the best players at their position ever. And they were playing a minor league game that went 33 innings. And even if you're not a baseball fan, baseball games are 9 innings. If you go into extra innings, maybe 10, 12, maybe 14 if things are really wild. 33 innings? That's almost 4 complete baseball games. You say, how can people just stand on the field for 33 innings? Well, they can't, because the game was started Saturday night, the day before Easter Sunday. And they called the game at 4 a.m. because it was snowing. And they sent everybody home, and the score was tied. And they resumed the game like 2.5 months later. And it went from the 14th inning or 15th inning at that time to the 33rd inning. It went another two full baseball games. The relief pitcher for Pawtucket was taken out of the game at about 2:30 in the morning, right? And he took a shower and he went home, and his wife met him at the door with a frying pan in her hair and saying, "Where the hell have you been?" And he said, "The game is still being played." And he said, "You liar! You liar!" And she slammed the door in his face and wouldn't let him come in. Okay, this book is the most amazing book I've ever read in my life. The Bottom of the 33rd by Dan Barry. He not only, the game is just secondary. Everything that's going on around this game is magnificent. You don't have to be a baseball fan at all. You don't have to understand most of what's going on as far as baseball is concerned. He goes back to the players in that box score 25 years later and tells you what became of their lives. Oh my God. Okay, I'm reading this book, right? And I'm just beside myself with joy. And I ration myself to 25 pages a day because I don't ever want it to be over. And I remember going into a pizza place one night with the book, right? And I'm sitting in the corner all by myself, and I'm roaring with laughter. And people all around me are, what are you doing? Finally, people came up and said, what are you reading? And I showed them this book. I said, just go to the nearest bookstore and buy this book. You'll never forgive yourself if you don't. Alas, I finished the book. What was the next thing I did? I opened it up and I started over again. Immediately. I didn't go get a beer. I just started it over again. And I limited myself to 15 pages a day so that I could draw out the beauty of what this guy has done. And my fervent desire, just once in my life, to ever write a sentence as good as what he can do. And the book is I'm now on my third copy of this book because I just wore it out, and I offer it as a lending library to people, and I still think it's the most fun I've ever had with a book. So go get it. You can get it in paperback. You can probably go on Amazon and get it for $6 or $2 or something. Anyhow, I finished that book and I wrote Dan Barry a letter, and I said, you know. I explained to him exactly what I did with that book, and he wrote me back a long letter in which he thanked me for his interest. He lives in South Orange, New Jersey, and works for the New York Times. I grew up in West Orange, New Jersey. And West Orange and South Orange, yes, they touch. And did West Orange High School despise everybody who ever went to Columbia High School? Yes. West Orange was the working class town. South Orange was the rich guy's town. And he said to me, you know, Ron, you may think I live in a rich guy's town, but there's a portion of South Orange called Maplewood, New Jersey, which is the poor guy's part of town, and that's where I live. Anyhow, we correspond frequently. And I wrote him a note after this, even though I hadn't finished it. I just read the first 3 paragraphs, and I wrote him a note. I sent him an email, and I said, Dan, home run. And he wrote me back a note that's in its entirety said, Ron, thanks. I can always count on you. And that was it. And it was just one writer appreciating brilliance in another writer. So you got to do this. You got to read people who can move and change your lives. You got to find out for yourself why you like this stuff. What makes it so wonderful? And you got to see if you can develop a style that will complement the thoughts that are going through your mind, so that it's not just like a 5 W's of journalism is who, what, where, why, and when, and they always need to be in the first paragraph. Baloney. They need to be covered somewhere in the story, but they don't need to be in the first paragraph. There isn't a 5 W lead in this story about Jane Doe ponytail. If there were, I probably wouldn't have read past the second paragraph unless I knew it was Dan Barry. Fashion is style. I once was at Columbia. This was after I went to Columbia for journalism school, graduate school, to get a master's degree. And I had worked for UPI for 5 years before I went back to school. And I was pretty proud of myself. You know, I was a professional journalist. Everybody else was basically coming directly out of undergraduate school and going for a master's degree. And so I'd been in the arena. These guys were just, they know nothing except what they learned from the books in their journalism courses at Johns Hopkins College. Okay. The movie reviewer from the Columbia journalism faculty is implemented with really good people who work in New York City to come in as adjunct professors. And one of our adjunct professors was a woman named Judith Christ. You would look at Judith Christ, and if know that if you ever called her Judy, that would be the last word that would come out of your mouth. Severe, the most severe person I ever saw in my life, but a crackerjack movie reviewer. Oh, my stuff is terrific. Google her, read a couple of her movie reviews. Okay, she taught a class on critical writing. And I was good because I was really fast, and everybody else was really slow. And I could get the thing done because I knew how stuff needed to be put in order. And I handed my review in first, and I left the room absolutely certain that I had bowled her over. How many people have seen the movie Christmas Story, where the poor kid writes the essay on the Red Ryder repeater rifle, and he's knocked it dead, right? I went out of that room knowing I knocked it dead, and the next time the class met and she handed the papers back, right across the top, she says, "You seem to know what you're doing, now develop a style." Oh my God, you talk about the wind out of your sails. This was just like Judith Chris took a sledgehammer and cracked me right directly in the middle of my gut. She just knocked the air out of me. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me, because I'm sitting there being so proud of myself and so superior to my 5-year younger. They called me grandpa in that class because everybody was at least 5 years younger than I. And so proud of this, and that I was a professional journalist, and they have never made a dime out of the profession. And she took me down so many pegs that I never quite recovered from it, but I never forgot. And my words to you today is, if you go into this profession, or if you don't, get a style. Make it yours. You read Dan Barry, and you know it's Dan Barry. You read Richard Russo, and you don't have to look at the cover of the book to see who the author was. You know it's Richard Russo. Get yourself a style. Read everything you possibly can. You'll become a better writer and a better person. Okay? Now, here comes before I let you have at me if you want, or leave if you want, this is the memoir. It's called, Of Course You Can Have Ice Cream for Breakfast, a journalist's uncommon memoir, and it's dedicated to my 4 grandkids, to whom you could never say, no, you can't have ice cream, even if they want it for breakfast. It's relatively new. It's 1 year old. It's got a lot of nice reviews, good stuff. The other one is something called Down to the Wire, UPI's Fight for Survival. I wrote this in 1990, but was working on it while I was employed by UPI, before I was unceremoniously fired for reporting these things that were going on that I later codified in a book. My co-author was fired a week before the book came out. The book was not a bestseller because it's a very narrow interest, but it won some wonderful awards. And I still happen to have copies of it. I'm going to give you my email address. It's ronco55@aol.com. If either of those books interest you, let me know, and we'll arrange to get them in your hands. End of.
Did you say your email again?
Ronco, 55@aol.com. All right? Send me an email if you're interested, and I'll let you know how to do it. Okay, have at me. You guys have been very quiet. What have I said that you don't want to agree with? What have I said that you want to agree with? Even better. You want to know why I'm still on AOL? Because I'm too stupid to do anything else. I know a lot of stuff. I can write like a charm, but these things, if my daughter Rachel, who's back in the back row, if she doesn't fix these things up for me, I never get it right. She between our visits, which is about every 5 or 6 months, I keep track of all the things I need correcting, and she gets them all done, along with my granddaughter Cammie, in about 4 minutes. So that's why AOL. Yes?
I came in a little late, so you may have already covered this, but what got you into journalism?
Oh, what a great question. Listen, you're going to hear people all the time. Somebody's going to ask a newsmaker a question, and they're going to say, that's a great question. First of all, it's either a question they weren't really expecting, and they don't think it's all that great, or they're fighting for some time to figure out what answer they can give which is going to be at least incriminating, okay? So if somebody tells you that's a great question, don't believe them. Believe me, that's a great question. After my sophomore year at the University of Illinois, I was, they forced, unlike these days where you can, I'm sorry, I was going to look something up here. Unlike these days where people start worrying about what their major is going to be when they're sophomores in high school, you know, and really that's happening, right? Well, it's happening. I had no clue. I knew that I had started working for the Daily Illini, the newspaper, when I was a freshman, and I really liked it, you know? I got to cover some interesting stuff. They made me, put me in charge of coverage of the college basketball, university basketball and football teams. I learned how to actually run a composing room. In the days before you pushed a button and something magically appeared in somebody's iPad, they had big machines that made a lot of noise. Did any of you go to see the Washington Post, the movie yesterday here about the Washington Post? Okay, look, it's tomorrow. Look at the thing called linotype machines. They're big mothers. They're monstrous things. Guys are sitting in front of them. They're filthy. They're covered from head to toe in purple blue paint. They've got paper hats on their heads to keep the blue ink from wrecking their hair forever, right? And they're all smoking stogies, right? And they never look up. They just pound away on these things. And every time they get to the end of a line, a piece of hot metal comes flying down a track, and it goes to a square, a rectangle. That's the front page or the third page of the paper. And they put those pieces of hot metal into this frame, and that's how they did a front page. And that's the way, you know, that's the way they do it. It's big machines making a lot of noise. I loved that. That was the greatest. Sometimes I would go down. The last edition came off the press at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I always had 8 o'clock classes. And I was down there fighting with a guy named Orville, who was, he had 2 unlighted stogies about this long each out of each side of his mouth. And he was about this tall, and he was the most frightening individual I've ever seen in my life. I was down there, and he could do something that I couldn't do yet, but I can do now. He could read upside down and backwards, which is the way the frame came up, because everything was set in upside down and backwards, so that when on the printing press, it came out right side up and forward. He was reading upside down and backward, and I was telling him to change the headline on the story. And he knew he had to do it because even though he was getting paid and I wasn't, I could make my life miserable for him. But he was going to make life miserable for me before I did. He says, "Are you sure you want to do this? You're still wet behind the ears. When did you get to be a senior? Freshmen don't do stuff like this." And I said, "Orville, I want you to do it." And he said, "I growl, you know." It was more fun you could have anywhere in the world. And I said, "I want to do this the rest of my life." So at the end of my sophomore year, not having any aptitude for anything, no math, no science, no languages, I didn't care about the law, I didn't care about anything, really, except astronomy, and that had math and science, and I was dead as far as that was concerned. So I said, all right, I'll go into journalism. That's how I went into journalism. And if you'll bear, we got about 10 minutes. Anybody who needs to leave can leave. But I wanted to read you one more little chapter, if I can find it. Oh, I've got the book. I've got the book. Imagine that. This guy who can't deal with electronic equipment was smart enough to bring the book. Okay, the name of the chapter is, I'm going to find it. Okay, it's called Almost Fired, Day 1, Part 1. The subsequent chapters, immediate subsequent chapters, are called Almost Fired, Day 1, Part 2, and Almost Fired, Day 1, Part 3. Yes, I, Ron Cohen, was almost fired from his first 3 jobs, all different jobs, on the very first day he was working. Okay, this is Part 1. January 15th, 1960, first day as a professional journalist, very nearly my last. It happened in Champaign, Illinois, where 6 months earlier, having ignored warnings from my high school journalism teacher that I possessed 0 aptitude for journalism, I earned a communications degree from the University of Illinois. Then, after 6 months active duty at Fort Dix, New Jersey, where I learned enough Morse code das and dits to qualify as a National Guard radio operator, and in need of a real job, I wrote to Harold Holmes, the avuncular editor of the Champaign News-Gazette. I remind him that I am a stranger. While a reporter for the Daily Illini, I'm no stranger. While a reporter for the Daily Illini, I had interviewed his son, Harold Jr., a tumbling wizard on the championship Illinois gymnastics team. Young Harold was newsworthy as one of the first to perfect the double backflip, 2 complete revolutions of his small but muscular body, sticking his dismount as if landing in wet cement. People now do 3 and 4, but Harold Holmes did 2, and he was brilliant. "You're hired, $60 a week," came the reply. "Report to city editor Bill Schmelzley right away." Stopping only for gas, I drove my shiny but tiny new Plymouth Valiant 600 miles from New Jersey to the familiar, tediously flat central Illinois fields of corn. Mr. Schmelzley, on a bright sunny January morning, issued my first reporting assignment. "Grab lunch, kid, then hustle out to cover the meeting of the sanitary district. 1 o'clock, sewage treatment plant outside of town." 2 years of journalism school and 4 years at the Daily Illini had not prepared me for my near-fatal professional initiation. Blame the pale winter sunlight slanting off a field of fresh snow, or a blast furnace masquerading as a conference room, or heavy eyelids courtesy of a hastily gulped Italian beef sandwich for lunch, or all 3. All I know is that Schmelzley's rookie reporter fought unsuccessfully to stay awake as a boring man in a dishwater gray suit flipped charts and droned on about artists' concepts. The room was emptying by the time I regained consciousness, and I made my fateful decision. No news here. Back at the office, I informed both Schmelzley and executive editor Ed Borman. No news there. In those days, gone forever as T-Rexes and honorable politicians, our 75,000 population then, community managed to support 2 competing daily afternoon newspapers. Our bitter rival was the Urbana Courier, smaller, feistier, and relentlessly hungry for journalistic victory. At 4:30 p.m. each weekday, a half-dozen copies of the Courier arrived in our newsroom to be combed for stories we may have missed. Across town, Courier staffers in turn were seeking our front page. At exactly 4:30 that very first afternoon, here comes Ed Borman galloping toward my desk, shouting like a wounded rhino. "Damn it, damn it, damn it all!" Brandishing inches from my schnoz a rolled-up copy of the Courier, its ink barely dry, he screams, "What the hell, Cohen?" Borman's sclerotic rage terrifies me. I had never seen someone actually stroke out. Slamming the newspaper on my desk, he jabs an index finger at a headline of a size normally reserved for aviation disasters, religious miracles, or the infrequent Illinois football success. "Plans for the new sewage plant." The words seem to be pulsating off the front page. By Dudley McAllister, Courier staff writer. I had never formally met McAllister, but clearly he attended the same meeting and managed to stay awake. In the ensuing minutes, hours, and days, I will learn more than I wished to about Dudley McAllister, but in those first panicky moments, I can only cringe and croak in my best Elmer Fudd imitation. "Never happened, I swear." Bad enough to be scooped on a big story, but my disgrace is compounded when Borman informs me, at decibels suggesting he was unaware of the proximity of my eardrums, that the site for this project is currently a golf course which is owned by my new employer. Bill Schmelzley, the no longer genial city editor, confines me to my desk in as the room explodes in furious activity, with staffers begging anybody remotely qualifying as a news source to shoot down McAllister's exclusive. We were dismissed at midnight. The entered frenzy resumes at dawn. I discovered that, although I am still technically, if temporarily employed, the unspoken message remains, stay out from underfoot, Cohen. Real journalists are at work. The result that afternoon, our very own tasteful, retaliatory banner headline, Courier Scoop, Flush Down Sewer. A classic journalism war has been launched. The papers trade volleys. Courier exposes on Wednesdays. News Gazette debunks on Thursdays. Repeat again. The day after the Gazette's oh-so-delicate scoop-flushing headline, there is a shocking retaliation, a front-page editorial in the Courier whose gist is, quote, the other paper is trying to say their reporter, whom nobody has ever heard of, is more worthy of your trust than Dudley McAllister, who has been covering the sanitary district and everything else in Champaign-Urbana longer than their reporter has even been alive. A 35-year veteran of the Courier, Mr. McAllister is the most respected journalist in the history of this community. The other paper's reporter is a total stranger. Okay, well, technically not total, since I have been in town for 4 years, but it's not easy to simultaneously quibble and cower. It concludes with this dart to the heart. He drove away from the meeting in a car with New Jersey license plates. Subtle. The Courier is equating my little red Valiant with Sonny Corleone's getaway limousine. Low blow, and I'm only half Italian. The war rages and I remain benched. But it is becoming obvious, even to casual observers, that the Courier has bigger guns and more information and more ammunition. My name seems destined to become a verb in journalism's Hall of Fame. Cohened, the act of being axed before ever typing a word. Happily for me, but unhappily for Dudley, the newspaper gods intervene. His car windows are rolled up tightly against the howling prairie winds and a blinding snowfall, as Dudley McAllister probably never heard the screaming sirens of the fire engine rushing through the red light at the downtown intersection. That afternoon, both papers printed front-page obituaries for Champaign-Urbana's legendary reporter. The Courier's was melodramatically wreathed in black. Next morning, Bill Schmelzley releases me from purgatory. Go interview this guy who has invented a unique fishing lure. Instead of bait, he has a package that just smells like worms. My lead was, sniff, strike, bam, dinner, smell-o-fishing. Schmelzley loved it, and I never looked back. Postscript, 6 decades later, the new sewage treatment plant on land owned by the News Gazette remains an artist's concept. Okay, go out and do good work. Anybody got any last minute things to say to me? Okay, go knock them dead. Thank you.